November 19th, 1940. Middle Wallop Airfield, Hampshire. Wing Commander John Cunningham sat in the cramped cockpit of his Bristol Beaufighter, watching the green glow of the airborne interception radar scope flicker in the darkness beside him. Behind him, Sergeant John Phillipson hunched over the bulky Mark IV radar set, its cathode ray tube casting strange shadows across his face. The equipment weighed nearly 300 pounds and filled most of the observer's position. Outside, England burned. German bombers had been pounding London and other cities for months, and British night fighters had proven almost useless at stopping them. The Blenheim fighters Cunningham had flown earlier were too slow to catch the raiders. Even when they found one, their 4 machine guns barely scratched the armoured German bombers. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. But tonight was different. Tonight, Cunningham flew a Beaufighter equipped with operational radar. The aircraft was something new, something the Luftwaffe had not yet encountered in force. 4 20mm Hispano cannons sat in the lower fuselage beneath his feet. Each shell weighed 4 ounces and could tear through aluminum like paper. 6 .303 caliber machine guns were mounted in the wings. The Beaufighter could deliver 780 pounds of fire per minute, more than any fighter in the world. Phillipson's voice crackled through the intercom. Contact. Bearing 030, range 3 miles. Cunningham turned the heavy fighter toward the target. The Beaufighter responded sluggishly compared to a Spitfire, but it had what the sleek day fighters lacked: the space to carry radar, the endurance to patrol for hours, and firepower that could destroy a bomber with a single burst. The radar operator called out corrections as they closed. 2 miles, 1 mile. The German crew never knew the British fighter was there until cannon shells began ripping through their Junkers 88. The bomber fell burning into the channel. It was the first confirmed kill by a radar-equipped night fighter in history. It would not be the last. What the Luftwaffe would come to learn over the next 4 years was that the aircraft they initially dismissed as too heavy, too slow, and too unwieldy was about to become one of the most effective combat aircraft of the war. The British had made a terrible mistake, and they knew it. In the 1930s, while Germany built the Messerschmitt 110 heavy fighter and rushed it into production, Britain focused on sleek, single-engine interceptors. The Spitfire and Hurricane were magnificent day fighters, but they could not patrol at night. They lacked the endurance for standing patrols, the space for radar equipment, and a second crew member to operate it. When Germany began night bombing in September 1940, Britain's air defences were nearly helpless. The night bombing campaign that would become known as the Blitz killed over 43,000 British civilians between September 1940 and May 1941. London burned night after night. Coventry was devastated. Bristol, Birmingham, Liverpool, and dozens of other cities suffered terrible damage. British anti-aircraft guns fired tens of thousands of shells into the darkness, hitting almost nothing. In September 1940, it took an average of 20,000 shells to bring down a single German bomber. Searchlights swept the sky, but even when they caught a bomber in their beams, British fighters could rarely reach it in time. The problem was not courage. British pilots flew into the darkness willingly, knowing they had almost no chance of finding the enemy. The problem was technology and doctrine. Night fighting required equipment that did not exist in practical form. Early attempts at airborne radar were crude and unreliable. The sets were so heavy that single-engine fighters could not carry them without crippling performance losses. Even when a fighter got close enough for a visual sighting, the darkness made accurate shooting nearly impossible. Britain's initial night fighter was the Blenheim, a light bomber hastily converted for the role. The Blenheim Mark I fighter carried a ventral gun pack with 4 machine guns added to its original single rear-facing gun. It was better than nothing, but not by much. The Blenheim was slow, poorly armed, and lacked space for effective radar. German bomber crews called it the least dangerous opponent they faced. British crews knew they were flying obsolete aircraft into combat against superior numbers. The Air Ministry had ordered the Westland Whirlwind, a proper heavy fighter with 4 cannons, but production problems delayed it repeatedly. By mid-1940, it was clear the Whirlwind would not arrive in time to matter. Britain needed an interim solution immediately, and they needed it from existing components and tooling. There was no time to design an entirely new aircraft. At the Bristol Aeroplane Company's works in Filton, chief designer Leslie Frise understood what was required. He had been designing aircraft since the Great War and knew that war demanded practical solutions, not perfect ones. In late 1938, before the Air Ministry even asked, Frise began sketching a heavy fighter based on the Beaufort torpedo bomber his company was already producing. The Beaufort had strong wings that could mount weapons, twin engines for endurance, and a spacious fuselage. If he narrowed the fuselage, shortened the nose, removed the bomb bay, and installed more powerful engines, it might work. The Air Ministry was sceptical. The proposed fighter would be heavy, at least 16,000 pounds fully loaded. It would be slower than single-engine fighters, perhaps 320 miles per hour at best. Would handle poorly, with a dangerous tendency to swing on takeoff. But it could carry 4 cannons, 6 machine guns, and all the radar equipment the scientists were developing. It could patrol for 6 hours. It could accommodate a pilot and radar operator in relative comfort. Most importantly, Bristol could begin production in months, not years, because it reused wings, tail surfaces, landing gear, and countless other components from the Beaufort. In March 1939, the Air Ministry ordered 4 prototypes and 300 production aircraft. The aircraft was given its name, Beaufighter, a combination of Beaufort and fighter. The specification called for an interim type to serve until better aircraft became available. No one expected it would still be in frontline service at war's end. The first prototype flew on July 17, 1939, just weeks before Germany invaded Poland. Test pilot Cyril Owens found the aircraft exactly as predicted. Heavy, difficult to fly, but impressively stable and solid. The 4 cannons fired from the lower fuselage, where the Beaufort's bomb aimer had sat. The recoil from a full burst actually slowed the aircraft in flight, a testament to the destructive power concentrated in the nose. The wings mounted 6 Browning machine guns, 4 in the starboard wing and 2 in the port, the asymmetry caused by the landing light mounted on the port side. Production Beaufighters began reaching squadrons in September 1940, just as the Blitz intensified. The first aircraft lacked radar sets, which were installed later at maintenance units. They also lacked the wing-mounted machine guns, as production of the ammunition feed system had fallen behind. But even with just the 4 cannons, the Beaufighter had more firepower than any bomber of the day could withstand. On October 25, 1940, a Beaufighter achieved its first kill, shooting down a Dornier 17 without radar, using ground, control and searchlights. Then came the night of November 19th, when Cunningham and Philipson demonstrated what a radar-equipped Beaufighter could do. Over the following months, as radar improved and crews gained experience, the aircraft began taking a toll on German night raiders. By March 1941, Beaufighters were responsible for half of all German aircraft destroyed by British fighters at night. During a massive raid on London on the night of May 19th to 20th, 1941, British night fighters shot down 24 German aircraft against only 2 destroyed by anti-aircraft fire. The Beaufighter was proving that technology and firepower could overcome the darkness. What made the aircraft revolutionary was not speed or agility, but the combination of capabilities it brought together. The spacious fuselage could accommodate early Mark IV radar without performance penalties. The second crew member could operate the radar while the pilot flew, essential in the high workload environment of night combat. The 4 cannons could destroy any bomber with a single burst, eliminating the need for prolonged dogfights in the dark. The twin Hercules engines provided reliability and the power to carry heavy loads. The aircraft could patrol for hours, remaining on station while faster fighters had to return to base. German pilots initially called the Beaufighter the heavy fighter, a term that carried a note of dismissal. They believed heavy fighters were inferior to single-engine aircraft and expected to outmaneuver or outrun them easily. This belief was about to be shattered, not over England, but over the waters where Coastal Command would prove that firepower mattered more than dogfighting ability. By early 1943, the Beaufighter had evolved far beyond its origins as an interim night fighter. Coastal Command had discovered that the aircraft excelled at a role no one had originally envisioned, destroying enemy shipping in daylight attacks. The Mark 10 torpedo fighter variant, commonly called the Torbo, carried either an 18-inch torpedo weighing nearly 2,000 pounds or 8 60-pound rocket projectiles mounted under the wings. The aircraft retained its 4 20mm cannons and could carry additional fuel in external tanks. The Hercules 17 engine, developing 1,735 horsepower at 500 feet altitude, gave the Mark 10 excellent low-level performance. RAF North Coats, on the Lincolnshire coast, became home to the most successful anti-shipping unit of the war. The North Coats Strike Wing combined multiple squadrons of Beaufighters using coordinated tactics that would revolutionize maritime attack operations. The concept was simple but required precise execution. Rocket-armed Beaufighters would attack first, targeting escort vessels and suppressing anti-aircraft fire. Their 60-pound rockets could penetrate ship hulls and destroy gun positions. While the escorts dealt with the rocket attack, torpedo-armed Torbos would come in at wave-top height, releasing their weapons at ranges as close as 800 yards from the target vessels. The statistics tell the story of the Strike Wing's effectiveness. Between mid-1943 and early 1945, the North Coats Wing alone accounted for over 150,000 tons of shipping destroyed. They sank 117 vessels, more than half the total tonnage destroyed by all Coastal Command Strike Wings combined during that period. The cost was equally stark. 120 Beaufighters were lost, and 241 aircrew killed or captured. Flying anti-shipping missions meant accepting casualty rates that would have broken most units. The crews knew the mathematics of their survival. In January 1943, Coastal Command calculated that aircrew had only a 40% chance of completing the operational tour. For Beaufighter squadrons attacking shipping, the survival rate dropped to 7%. 7 men in 100 could expect to live through their required missions. The other 93 would die or spend the rest of the war in prisoner-of-war camps. Yet men continued to volunteer for the Strike Wings. They came from Britain, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, drawn by the reputation of the Beaufighter and the promise of hitting the enemy where it hurt. The aircraft gave them a fighting chance that earlier types had not. Flying Officer Peter Hughes of 489 Squadron, Royal New Zealand Air Force, described the transition from Hamptons to Beaufighters. The Beaufighter was tough. It could take punishment that would have destroyed other aircraft. The armament gave us the firepower to suppress flak while making our attack runs. We learned to trust the aircraft, even when we were flying into hell. The tactics evolved through hard experience. Early attacks had sent aircraft in one at a time, making each Beaufighter an isolated target for every gun on every ship. The Strike Wings developed coordinated mass attacks that overwhelmed defensive fire. Beaufighters would approach at extremely low altitude, sometimes just feet above the waves, using the sea clutter to mask their radar signatures until the last possible moment. The first wave would pop up to attack height, fire their rockets at escort vessels and flak ships, then dive back to wave-top height. The second wave, carrying torpedoes, would follow seconds behind, releasing their weapons before the German gunners could reorient their fire. The Germans adapted their tactics in response. Convoy escorts increased their anti-aircraft armament dramatically. Single merchant ships no longer sailed. Every cargo vessel travelled with dedicated flagships that carried nothing but anti-aircraft guns. By late 1944, some flak ships mounted over 20 heavy guns and dozens of lighter weapons. The volume of fire they could generate would fill the sky with steel. Beaufighter crews described flying through flak so dense it seemed impossible that anything could survive. Yet the aircraft kept coming, and ships kept sinking. German fighter units deployed to Norway to protect the convoy routes. Junkers, 88 fighters, and Focke-Wulf 190 interceptors began flying escort missions for ships in transit. The Beaufighter crews found themselves fighting not just anti-aircraft fire, but enemy fighters while trying to maintain attack formations at low altitude. The strike wings requested fighter escorts, and by early 1945, Mustang squadrons regularly accompanied Beaufighter strikes. The most demanding targets were those sheltering in Norwegian fjords. The steep-sided valleys provided natural protection from attack, forcing the Beaufighters to fly in through narrow openings where all defensive fire could concentrate on single aircraft. Attacking a fjord anchorage meant accepting that casualties would be high. Wing commanders planned these missions knowing they would lose aircraft. Crews flew them, knowing the odds were terrible. They did it anyway because the targets were worth it, and because stopping German supply shipments would help end the war. February 9th, 1945. Førde, Norway. At 3:50 in the afternoon, 2 Beaufighters from 489 Squadron, Royal New Zealand Air Force, flew low over the dark water, conducting a routine reconnaissance patrol. The crews expected to find merchant ships, perhaps a small escort. Instead, they spotted a Narvik-class destroyer, the Z-33, accompanied by a minesweeper and 2 dedicated flak ships anchored in the protected waters of the fjord. The reconnaissance crews radioed the sighting to RAF Dallachie in Scotland, where the Dallachie Strike Wing waited on alert. The wing comprised 4 squadrons: 144 Squadron RAF, 404 Squadron, Royal Canadian Air Force, 455 Squadron Royal Australian Air Force, and 489 Squadron Royal New Zealand Air Force. These were veteran units that had flown dozens of successful strikes. Their crews had developed the tactics, refined the approaches, and learned to survive in an environment where survival seemed impossible. Wing Commander Colin Milson, 25 years old, and commanding the strike, studied the target information and felt deep misgivings. The reconnaissance aircraft had also reported 5 large merchant ships in nearby Nord-Gulen, vulnerable and undefended. Those ships were valuable targets that could be attacked with minimal losses. But the Admiralty had issued clear orders. Warships took priority over merchant vessels. Z-33 was a rare prize, and despite the defensive position, the strike would go forward. At 1:30 that afternoon, 32 Beaufighters lifted from Dallachie and formed up over Scotland. 10 Mustang fighters from 65 Squadron joined them as escort. 2 Warwick Air-Sea rescue aircraft, carrying inflatable rafts for any crew forced to ditch, completed the formation. The aircraft from 404 and 455 Squadrons carried rockets. Those from 144 and 489 Squadrons carried only their cannons and machine guns, relying on firepower alone. The formation crossed the North Sea and reached the Norwegian coast at 3:40. 2 Beaufighters pushed ahead as outriders, tasked with confirming the target location before the main force arrived. At 3:50, the outriders radioed that the ships were no longer in the position reported that morning. They turned to search further up Førde Fjord. The Germans, alerted by the reconnaissance flights hours earlier, scrambled 12 Focke-Wulf 190 fighters from Herdia Airfield. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Minutes later, the main formation arrived at the fjord entrance. To their shock, they flew directly over Z-33 and the escort vessels. The German ships opened fire immediately. Streams of tracer arced upward, filling the sky ahead of the Beaufighters. But in the initial surprise, none of the aircraft were hit. Milson wheeled the formation right, looking for an approach that would let them attack from east to west as planned. The steep walls of the fjord made that impossible. The cliffs rose thousands of feet, creating a natural fortress that protected the ships from any angle of attack except directly along the fjord. Milson led the formation west toward the mouth of the fjord, then ordered the Beaufighters to attack in relays from west to east. It was the only option, but it meant flying directly into alerted defences and then climbing over mountains to escape. The narrow confines meant they could not swamp the defences with simultaneous attacks from multiple directions. Each aircraft would have to run the gauntlet alone, while every gun on every ship concentrated its fire. At 4-10, Milson led the first group of Beaufighters into Förde Fjord. The German gunners were ready. Anti-aircraft fire erupted from Z-33, from the minesweeper, from the two flak ships, and from shore batteries the reconnaissance had not detected. The sky filled with explosive shells and tracer rounds. Beaufighters dove through the storm of fire, launched their rockets at Z-33, and pulled up hard to clear the surrounding mountains. The Focke-Wulf fighters arrived as the second wave entered the fjord. The Mustang escorts engaged them immediately, turning the confined airspace into a chaotic dogfight involving over 50 aircraft. The German fighters were aggressive and experienced. They exploited every advantage, attacking Beaufighters as they climbed away from their attack runs when the heavy fighters were most vulnerable. The Mustangs fought to protect them, but in the narrow fjord, numerical superiority meant nothing. Position and timing decided each engagement. Wave after wave of Beaufighters pressed the attack. Some scored rocket hits on Z-33 and damaged other vessels. The price was catastrophic. Flak tore through aircraft, destroying engines, severing control cables, killing crew. Beaufighters fell burning into the fjord or crashed into the steep hillsides. The Focke-Wulfs shot down 2 more Beaufighters and 1 Mustang. The Allied fighters destroyed 4 or 5 German aircraft, including the plane flown by Lieutenant Rudi Linz, an ace with 70 confirmed victories. By 4:25, the strike wing broke off the attack. The surviving Beaufighters, many badly damaged, turned for home. Several struggled to maintain altitude on one engine. 2 aircraft made belly landings at Dalaki when their damaged landing gear would not extend. When the final count was made, 9 Beaufighters and 1 Mustang had been lost. 14 aircrew were dead, 4 more captured. 6 of the 11 aircraft from 404 Squadron had been destroyed, the highest percentage loss any single squadron suffered. The ground crews at Dalaki stood in shock as the damaged aircraft returned. They had seen heavy losses before, but nothing like this. The aircrew who survived called it Black Friday. It was the highest single mission loss any Coastal Command strike wing suffered during the entire war. Z-33 had been damaged but not sunk. The destroyer sailed that night and reached Trondheim 2 days later for repairs. Yet the mission demonstrated something crucial about the Beaufighter and the men who flew it. Despite impossible conditions, despite overwhelming defensive fire, despite German fighters and confined terrain that eliminated every tactical advantage, the strike wing had pressed home their attack. They had hit their target, they had damaged a valuable warship, and the aircraft, battered and shot, being full of holes, had brought many of their crews home alive. A lighter aircraft would have been shot to pieces. A less heavily armed aircraft could not have suppressed enough defensive fire to let any crews survive. Black Friday was a defeat, but it was not a failure of the aircraft or the tactics. It was the inevitable result of attacking the most difficult possible target in the worst possible conditions. That the strike wing had been ordered to attack a well-defended destroyer in a protected fjord rather than the vulnerable merchant ships nearby revealed the strategic value the Admiralty placed on eliminating German warships, even at terrible cost. The Beaufighter had been designed as a stopgap measure, an interim heavy fighter to serve until better aircraft arrived. It had been dismissed as too heavy, too slow, too difficult to fly. Yet, by early 1945, it had destroyed more enemy shipping than any other aircraft type. It had sunk German destroyers, supply ships, minesweepers, and transports. It had closed critical supply routes. It had forced the German Navy to abandon daylight operations along the Norwegian coast, and it had done all this while absorbing punishment that would have destroyed lesser aircraft. The men who flew the Beaufighter understood what the German pilots who first encountered it had learned. Weight and firepower mattered more than maneuverability when the mission was destroying ships or bombers. The heavy fighter concept, dismissed by many before the war, had proven itself in the crucible of combat. The aircraft called too heavy to succeed had shattered the expectations of those who doubted it. The war in Europe ended 3 months after Black Friday. On May 8, 1945, Germany surrendered unconditionally. Coastal Command's strike wings had achieved their objective. The Norwegian coastal routes were effectively closed to German shipping. Merchant vessels that once sailed in daylight now dared move only at night, and even then under constant threat. The iron ore shipments from Narvik that fed German industry had been cut to a trickle. Supply lines that sustained German forces in Norway were severed. The Beaufighter squadrons had paid a terrible price for this victory, but they had won. Wing Commander Colin Milson, who led the Black Friday strike, received a bar to his Distinguished Service Order in July 1945. The citation described the Førdefjord attack as a brilliantly executed operation, though that phrase could not erase the knowledge of the men who had not returned. Milson survived the war and carried the memory of that February afternoon for the rest of his life. The cost of command in wartime was measured not just in personal risk, but in the weight of ordering men into situations where death was probable. The surviving crews from Black Friday returned to operations. They flew missions against German shipping until the surrender, then began the transition to peacetime duties or demobilization. Some remained in service, others returned to civilian life. All carried memories of burning aircraft, of friends lost over Norwegian fjords, of the moment when training and courage met the reality of concentrated defensive fire. These men had proven that even in defeat, the Beaufighter could accomplish its mission, when crewed by determined pilots and navigators. Production of the Beaufighter continued until September 21, 1945. The last aircraft, serial number SR-919, rolled out of Bristol's Western Supermare factory 2 weeks after Japan surrendered. Total British production reached 5,562 aircraft. Of these, 1,063 were Mark VI variants and 2,231 were Mark X torpedo fighters. Australia's Department of Aircraft Production built an additional 364 aircraft, bringing total production to 5,926 Beaufighters. 52 RAF squadrons operated Beaufighters during the war, along with squadrons from Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, and the United States. The aircraft served in every theatre of the conflict: over Britain during the Blitz, in the Mediterranean against Axis shipping, in North Africa supporting ground forces, over Burma against Japanese supply lines, and in the Pacific during the final campaigns. By the war's end, 70 RAF pilots had achieved ace status while flying Beaufighters, testament to the aircraft's effectiveness in combat. Post-war, many Beaufighters were converted to target tug duties. The aircraft's reliability and endurance made it ideal for towing targets for anti-aircraft gunnery practice. These target tug variants, designated TT Mark X, served throughout the 1950s. The final RAF Beaufighter sortie occurred on May 12, 1960, when a TT Mark X completed a target towing mission from Seletar in Singapore. 20 years after the first prototype flew, the last Beaufighter retired from operational service, ending one of the longest service careers of any World War II combat aircraft. The Beaufighter's legacy extended beyond its operational record. The aircraft proved that heavy fighters could be effective when designed for specific missions rather than attempting to match single-engine fighters in dogfighting capability. The night fighter role, the anti-shipping mission, and the ground attack operations all required characteristics that favored twin-engine designs: endurance, payload capacity, survivability, and heavy armament. The Beaufighter excelled in these roles because it was optimized for them, not despite being a heavy fighter. The strike-wing tactics developed by coastal command units became the foundation for post-war anti-shipping doctrine. The concept of coordinated mass attacks, with specialized aircraft suppressing defenses while others delivered the primary weapons, influenced naval air warfare for decades. Modern anti-ship missile tactics still reflect the basic principles proven effective by Beaufighter crews over Norwegian waters: overwhelm defenses, hit hard, escape quickly. The men who flew Beaufighters established traditions and standards that shaped post-war air forces throughout the Commonwealth. The professionalism, tactical innovation, and determination they demonstrated under conditions of terrible loss rates set benchmarks for future generations. The 7% survival rate for strike-wing crews was known to every man who volunteered for the squadrons, yet they continued to volunteer because the mission mattered and because they believed their aircraft gave them a fighting chance. November 19, 1940, seems impossibly distant from February 9, 1945. 4 years and 3 months separated John Cunningham's first radar-guided kill from the Black Friday losses over Førde Fjord. In that span, the Beaufighter evolved from a stopgap night fighter into the most effective anti-shipping aircraft of the war. The aircraft that Luftwaffe pilots initially dismissed as too heavy to be dangerous had destroyed over 150,000 tons of German shipping and sunk hundreds of vessels. The irony at the heart of the Beaufighter's story is that what made it vulnerable also made it effective. The heavy weight that reduced maneuverability allowed it to carry devastating armament and absorb battle damage. The large size that made it an easier target provided space for radar, torpedoes, rockets, and fuel tanks. The twin engines that complicated handling gave reliability and redundancy that brought damaged aircraft home. Every characteristic that seemed like a weakness when measured against single-engine day fighters became a strength when measured against the missions the aircraft actually flew. German pilots learned this lesson through hard experience. The bombers attacking Britain at night discovered that 4 20mm cannons fired by a radar-guided interceptor were lethal. The crews manning flak ships in the North Sea learned that Beaufighters attacking in coordinated waves could deliver more firepower than defensive guns could stop. The commanders planning convoy operations learned that no route was safe when strike wings could appear at wave-top height with torpedoes and rockets. The Luftwaffe never called the Beaufighter heavy as a compliment after the first encounters. By 1943, German intelligence reports described the aircraft as extremely dangerous, particularly in anti-shipping operations. Luftwaffe fighter pilots assigned to escort convoys knew that engaging Beaufighters at low altitude while trying to protect ships from torpedo attack was among the most difficult missions they could fly. The aircraft they had dismissed as too slow and cumbersome was destroying German shipping faster than it could be replaced. In the Pacific, Japanese forces gave the Beaufighter a nickname that captured its effectiveness: Whispering Death. The sleeve valve Hercules engines ran quietly compared to conventional poppet valve designs. Beaufighters could approach targets at low altitude without the characteristic engine noise that warned of impending attack. By the time defenders heard the aircraft, cannon fire and rockets were already impacting. The psychological effect of an enemy that struck without warning, that could not be heard until too late, added to the material destruction the aircraft inflicted. The broader lesson of the Beaufighter extends beyond aviation to military effectiveness generally. Purpose-built solutions optimized for specific missions outperform general-purpose platforms trying to do everything. The Beaufighter was never the fastest fighter, never the most maneuverable, never the easiest to fly. But it was exactly what was needed for night fighting, anti-shipping strikes, and ground attack operations. It succeeded because designers focused on the missions that mattered rather than trying to match characteristics that mattered less. The aircraft also demonstrated that interim solutions can become permanent successes. The Beaufighter was designed as a stopgap until better aircraft arrived. The Mosquito eventually superseded it in the night fighter role, as planned. But in anti-shipping operations, the Beaufighter remained the primary weapon throughout the war. No better alternative emerged because the Beaufighter was already good enough. Sometimes good enough, available now, and proven in combat, is better than perfect arriving too late. The men who designed, built, and flew Beaufighters never intended to create a legendary aircraft. Leslie Fries sketched a heavy fighter based on bomber components because Britain desperately needed something immediately and had no time to develop ideal solutions. Bristol workers assembled aircraft from Beaufort parts and new fuselages because that was the fastest way to get fighters to squadrons. Pilots flew Beaufighters into defensive fire that should have destroyed them because those were the targets that needed to be hit. None of them set out to prove that heavy fighters could work. They simply did what circumstances required and discovered that it worked. By the time the last Beaufighter retired in 1960, the lessons of its service had been incorporated into air forces worldwide. Heavy fighters had proven their worth when properly employed. Strike tactics developed by Coastal Command had become doctrine. The aircraft that skeptics doubted, that critics dismissed as too heavy, had outlasted most of its contemporaries and influenced military aviation for generations. The sign that hung in John Cunningham's squadron operations room during the dark winter of 1940-41 captured what the Beaufighter represented. The first duty of fighters is to destroy enemy aircraft. Not to be fast, not to be maneuverable, not to be elegant. To destroy the enemy. The Beaufighter fulfilled that duty across every theatre of the war, in every role it was assigned, regardless of the cost. 4 20mm cannons and 6 machine guns, mounted in an aircraft dismissed as too heavy, shredded German bombers over Britain, sank Axis ships in the Mediterranean, destroyed Japanese transports in the Pacific, and forced the Luftwaffe to abandon daylight operations over Norwegian waters. What seemed like a liability proved to be exactly what was needed. The heavy fighter worked because it had to, because men made it work, because the alternative was accepting defeat. That stubborn refusal to accept that something could not be done, that determination to make imperfect solutions succeed through skill and courage, defined the Beaufighter's legacy more than any technical specification or combat statistic. When the North Coast's strike wing survivors gathered after the war to remember their fallen comrades, they spoke of aircraft that brought them home with engines shot out, wings full of holes, hydraulics failed. They remembered the sound of cannons firing, the impact of rockets launching, the white tracks of torpedoes running true toward target ships. They remembered fear and loss and victory, and they remembered the aircraft that gave them a chance to survive long enough to win. The Bristol Beaufighter, too heavy to succeed by conventional measures, heavy enough to matter when it counted most. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.